Weddings are the single greatest lie we tell ourselves. We drape everything in imported silk and white orchids, pretending the day is about eternal love, when it is usually just a high-stakes performance for relatives who secretly despise one another. I am Ashley Smith. For years, I was the invisible wallet, the fixer my family used and discarded. They skipped my MBA graduation because my sister had a meltdown over napkin colors, then had the nerve to demand I plan her second wedding for free. They wanted the spotlight, so I decided to give them a front row seat to their own humiliation. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. Let me take you back to where the first flower was placed. Move the hydrangeas 2 inches to the left. The light hits the petals wrong at this angle, and the bride wants ethereal, not washed out. My voice didn't rise above a conversational volume, but the 3 florists scrambling around the ballroom froze, then immediately adjusted the massive crystal vases. I checked the time on my wrist, a sleek silver timepiece I had bought myself with my first bonus. We were 4 minutes ahead of schedule. In my line of work, 4 minutes was a lifetime. I was Ashley Smith, and in the cutthroat world of high-end event planning, I was known simply as the architect. I didn't just plan weddings, I constructed moments. I built fairy tales for people who could afford the down payment on a dream, ensuring that every napkin fold was crisp, every champagne flute was spotless, and every mother-in-law was sufficiently distracted. Standing there in the center of the gilded ballroom, watching the staff polish the marble floors until they looked like liquid water, I felt that familiar surge of control. It was the only place I truly felt it. Out here, amidst the silk runners and the scent of imported orchids, I commanded respect. I was indispensable. It was a stark, painful contrast to the life I left behind every time I clocked out a life where I was not the architect, but merely the spare part. The invisible daughter. The vibration of my phone in my blazer pocket pulled me from my inspection. I ignored it. I knew who it was without looking, and I knew the voicemail would be a demand, not a request. It was always the same. My family had a radar for the exact moment I achieved something professional, and they possessed an uncanny ability to interrupt it with a trivial crisis involving my sister Tiffany. It triggered a memory I tried to keep locked in a mental box, one that still stung with fresh humiliation 2 years later. I was standing on the lawn of the university, the sun beating down on my black polyester gown. I was clutching my MBA diploma, the culmination of 2 years of sleepless nights, caffeine overdoses, and grueling internships. I had graduated with honors. I scanned the crowd of cheering parents searching for the 2 faces that mattered. I looked for my father's gray suit and my mother's floral Sunday dress. I saw families hugging fathers, crying, mothers arranging tassels for photos. I saw everyone else's pride. Then my phone had buzzed. "Ashley, honey." My mother's voice had been breathless, frantic. "We're so sorry, but we're not going to make it to the ceremony, or the lunch." I remembered gripping the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. "Mom, I'm walking across the stage in 20 minutes. You promised." I know." She sighed, the sound of a waitress taking an order audible in the background. "But Tiffany is having a meltdown. Absolute crisis. She's at the venue for her engagement party. You know, the one for her and what's his name, the pilot, and the napkins are the wrong shade of salmon. She's threatening to call off the whole engagement if we don't fix the aesthetic immediately. She needs us, Ashley. You know how sensitive your sister is." "I'm graduating," I had whispered, my voice cracking. "I have a master's degree." "And we are so proud, really," my mother said, clearly distracted. "But you're the strong one, Ashley. You don't need us to hold your hand. Tiffany, well, she needs support. We'll celebrate later. Maybe dinner next week." They never took me to dinner. Tiffany's engagement to the pilot lasted 3 months before she got bored, but my graduation came and went unmarked and uncelebrated. I sat alone at a diner that afternoon, eating a burger in my graduation gown, while my parents soothed a 28-year-old woman crying over paper napkins. That was the dynamic. Tiffany was the fragile golden figurine that had to be protected at all costs. I was the cardboard box she came in, sturdy, utilitarian, and easily discarded once the prize was secured. The memory faded as the head caterer approached me with a question about the gluten-free options, snapping me back to the present. I handled the issue with a smile, but the ice in my chest remained. That old wound was about to be ripped open again. Later that evening, I found myself sitting in a booth at an Italian restaurant my parents favored. It was family announcement night, which usually meant Tiffany wanted something. My sister sat across from me, glowing. She was undeniably beautiful, with the kind of high-maintenance blonde hair that required weekly salon visits my parents undoubtedly paid for. She waved her hand in my face, the diamond on her ring finger catching the candlelight. "Mark proposed," she squealed. Mark, the new one. He was a quiet, unassuming accountant, nice, stable, and completely under Tiffany's thumb. I managed a polite smile. "Congratulations, Tiff. He seems like a good guy." "He's perfect," my mother gushed, clasping her hands. "A second chance at happiness for our baby girl." "And this time," my father added, leaning forward, "we're going to do it right, no cutting corners, a real society wedding." I took a sip of water, sensing the trap closing in. "That sounds lovely. I'm sure you'll hire a great team." The table went silent. My mother exchanged a look with Tiffany. My father cleared his throat. "Well, actually," Tiffany said, picking at her bread roll, "that's what we wanted to talk to you about. We don't need to hire a team. We have you." I set my glass down slowly. "I'm sorry. You're the best planner in the city," my mother said, her tone implying this was a compliment rather than a conscription. "It's perfect. You can plan the wedding. Mark's mother is particular. She has money, old money, and we need to impress her. We need your taste, Ashley." "My rates start at 10,000 for coordination," I said, keeping my voice professional. "Full planning is 15% of the total budget." Tiffany laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "Don't be silly. You're not charging us. Your family." "It's your contribution," my father stated, his voice dropping an octave, the authority of the patriarch coming into play. "You've been so busy with your little career running around the city skipping Sunday dinners, you barely help your mother around the house anymore. Tiffany is there every day." "Tiffany lives there," I pointed out, my temper flaring. "Rent-free. I pay a mortgage." "Because you're successful," Tiffany snapped. "You have everything, Ashley. You have the money, the independence, the fancy apartment. I'm trying to build a life here. The least you can do is help me get my start. Unless you want me to be unhappy, do you want me to be embarrassed in front of Mark's family?" "It's a lot of work, Tiffany. It's hundreds of hours," I argued, looking at my parents for backup. I found none. Their faces were hard, expectant. "We sacrificed a lot for you to get that degree," my mother said, playing her favorite card, conveniently forgetting they hadn't paid a dime of my tuition. I had worked 3 jobs. "It's time to give back. Do this for your sister. Do it for the family." I looked at them. I looked at Tiffany's smug expression, the certainty in her eyes that I would fold because I always folded. I looked at my parents, who saw my time and talent as their property to distribute. They wanted a show. They wanted me to create a masterpiece so they could bask in the applause while I swept up the confetti. The anger didn't explode. It calcified. It turned into something cold and hard and incredibly sharp. If they wanted my professional expertise, they were going to get it. All of it. "Fine," I said. The word hung in the air, heavy and final. Tiffany clapped her hands. "Yay! Oh, I have so many ideas. I want a royal theme and I want—" I held up a hand, silencing her. The gesture was so authoritative that even my father blinked. "I will do it," I said, my voice smooth, devoid of the warmth they expected. "I will plan the entire thing for free. I will get you the best vendors, the best decor, the most exclusive venue. I will make you look like royalty." Tiffany beamed, but I wasn't finished. "But here is the condition." I continued, leaning in, locking eyes with each of them. "If I am doing this, I am the boss, the captain, no micromanaging, No second-guessing my choices. You show up, you look pretty, and you sit exactly where I tell you to sit. You trust my vision completely. If you argue with me on one single detail, I walk, and you can plan this circus yourself. Of course, my mother said, relieved to have the burden lifted. We trust you, Ashley. We just want it to be beautiful. Oh, it will be. I promised, a small, tight smile playing on my lips. It will be a day none of us will ever forget. They went back to their wine, celebrating their victory, completely unaware that they had just handed the weapon directly to the executioner. They wanted the spotlight, I would give it to them. I would give them exactly what they deserved. The next 3 months were a blur of Egyptian cotton imported silk and the scent of desperation masked by expensive perfume. I didn't just plan the wedding. I curated a military campaign disguised as a celebration. I threw myself into the logistics with a fervor that bordered on obsessive, partly because it was my nature to be perfect, but mostly because every flawless detail I secured was another brick in the wall I was building around my family. I secured the St. Regis Ballroom, a venue that usually had a 2-year waiting list, by calling in a favor from a hotel manager I'd saved from a PR nightmare the previous winter. I flew in peonies from Holland because Tiffany decided roses were too pedestrian. I hired a string quartet that had played at the White House. The budget was astronomical. Mark's family was paying for the bulk of the reception, a fact my parents conveniently glossed over while they bragged to their friends about the event of the century they were hosting. My parents were contributing just enough to feel entitled to make demands, but it was clear the real financial power lay with the groom's side. I met Mark first. He was a sweet, soft-spoken man with kind eyes and a spine made of gelatin. He looked at Tiffany like she was a rare, breakable artifact, constantly apologizing for things that weren't his fault. It was easy to see why Tiffany liked him. He was an audience of one, always clapping, never questioning. Then I met Eleanor. Eleanor Vance was not merely a mother-in-law, she was an institution. She walked into the first vendor meeting wearing a Chanel suit that cost more than my car, her silver hair coiffed into a helmet of intimidation. She didn't walk. She glided like a shark patrolling a reef. She was old money, the kind of wealth that whispers rather than shouts. When she spoke, the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "So," Eleanor said, looking at me over the rim of her spectacles during our first sit-down, "you are the sister, and the planner, an economical choice." "I prefer efficient, Mrs. Vance," I replied, not breaking eye contact. "I know Tiffany's tastes better than anyone, and I know how to execute them without bankrupting the spirit of the occasion." Eleanor hummed a sound that could have been approval or disdain. "We shall see." The first crack in the facade appeared during the menu tasting. We were seated in the private dining room of the catering company, me, Tiffany, Mark, my parents, and Eleanor. The chef, a temperamental genius named Henri, brought out the third course, a lobster bisque with a cognac reduction. It was exquisite, rich, velvety, perfect. Tiffany took one spoon, made a face, and dropped the spoon back into the bowl with a loud clatter that echoed off the walls. "It's cold," she announced. Henri stiffened. "Mademoiselle, it was ladled 3 seconds ago. It is steaming." "It's lukewarm," Tiffany snapped. "And it tastes fishy. I wanted seafood, not a fish tank. Take it away, and bring me a Diet Coke. With lime, not lemon. If I see a lemon, I'm leaving." The silence in the room was suffocating. Mark looked down at his lap. My parents smiled nervously, my mother reaching out to pat Tiffany's hand. "She's just stressed, Henri. You know how brides are." I saw Eleanor's eyes narrow. She looked at Tiffany with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a particularly disappointing lab rat. I stood up, smoothing my skirt. I walked over to the server, a young girl named Sarah who looked like she was about to cry, and Henri who looked like he was about to commit a felony. "Henri," I said softly, stepping between him and my sister. "The bisque is phenomenal. The depth of flavor is exactly what we discussed. However, my sister's palate is currently compromised by stress. Please leave the tureen. I will finish it. And Sarah, please bring the Diet Coke. Lime on the side. You're doing a wonderful job. I slipped a $20 bill into Sarah's hand, shielded from the table's view by my blazer. She nodded, sniffing back a tear, and hurried off. I turned back to Henri. We will take the short rib option for the main. Thank you. When I sat back down, the tension had dissipated, replaced by the clinking of silverware. But I felt a gaze burning into the side of my head. I turned to find Eleanor watching me. She didn't smile, but she raised her wine glass in a microscopic salute. Later that afternoon, during a break in the schedule, the chaos had moved to the bridal suite, where Tiffany was screaming about the font size on the place cards. I had stepped out into the hallway, sitting on a velvet bench, my laptop balanced on my knees. I was answering emails for my actual job, a corporate merger event I was consulting on while simultaneously ordering customized linens for Tiffany. A shadow fell over my screen. It was Eleanor. "You have a paying job, do you not?" she asked, her voice dry. "I do," I said, typing a final sentence and closing the laptop. "I'm a senior logistics consultant for a firm downtown. I took a leave of absence to handle this." "A leave of absence," she repeated. "To plan a party for a sister who doesn't know the difference between a cognac reduction and low tide." I kept my face neutral. "Family is family, Mrs. Vance." "Is it?" She sat down next to me, maintaining a strict 6 inches of personal space. "I watched you in there. You manage her. You manage the staff. You manage your parents. It must be exhausting." "I'm used to it," I said. "Does your sister appreciate this?" Eleanor asked. The question was sharp, probing. I looked at the closed door of the bridal suite, where I could hear Tiffany berating Mark about the color of his cummerbund. I thought about the graduation ceremony I had attended alone. I thought about the thousands of dollars of billable hours I was losing to plan this event for free. "My sister believes the world owes her a stage, Mrs. Vance," I said quietly, meeting the matriarch's steely gaze. "I'm just the stagehand. Stagehands aren't appreciated, they're expected." Eleanor looked at me for a long moment. "I have always found that the stagehand holds the power to drop the curtain whenever they choose," she murmured. Then she stood up and walked away, her heels clicking rhythmically on the marble. The planning continued, and the demands grew more ludicrous. 2 weeks before the wedding, we were finalizing the floor plan. This was the moment, the pivot point. We were in my apartment, gathered around my large dining table covered in blueprints. Tiffany was drinking my wine and critiquing my furniture. "The head table," Tiffany declared, tapping a long manicured fingernail on the center of the layout. "I don't want a normal head table. I want a dais, a raised platform, like royalty. I want me, Mark, Mom, and Dad sitting above everyone else, looking down on them." "And Mark's family?" I asked, my voice steady. "Where do they sit?" "Oh, put them at the round tables near the front." Tiffany waved her hand dismissively. "They're just guests. The dais is for the immediate family, the stars of the show." "Mark's mother is paying for the liquor, Tiffany," I reminded her. "She might expect to be honored." "She is honored. She gets to watch her son marry me." Tiffany laughed. "Just do it, Ashley. Raised platform, center stage. I want to see everyone, and I want everyone to look up at me." My parents nodded in agreement. "It's her day," my father said, leaning back in my chair. "Let her have the platform. We should be highlighted. We're the hosts, after all." I looked at the blueprint. I looked at the digital version on my tablet. This was it. The moment they signed their own social death warrant. "Okay," I said, forcing a warm, compliant smile. "A raised dais for the bridegroom and parents. Everyone else on the floor. I'll make it happen." I tapped the screen of my tablet. I highlighted the block labeled Head Table. I dragged it. On the large printed blueprint in front of them, the table was in the center. But on the digital file, the one that would be sent to the venue staff, the caterers, and the lighting crew, I moved the table. I didn't delete it. I just relocated it. "I'll handle the seating chart personally," I told them. "You won't have to lift a finger." "Perfect," Tiffany sighed, refilling her glass. "Finally, you're making things easy." The final nail in the coffin came at the rehearsal dinner. It was held at a posh steakhouse the night before the wedding. The mood was raucous, fueled by expensive Cabernet. Eleanor was seated at the head of the table, looking like a judge presiding over a chaotic courtroom. My father stood up to give a toast. He was flushed, happy, and arrogant. "To my beautiful daughter Tiffany," he boomed, raising his glass. "We are so proud. You know raising girls isn't easy." He chuckled, glancing at Mark's family. "We've had our hands full. But moments like this make it all worth it. We've always prioritized being there for our girls' big moments." I froze. I saw Eleanor's eyes flick toward me. "That's right," my mother chimed in, laughing. "Even if we have to divide and conquer. Remember when we missed Ashley's college graduation? Oh God, that was a scheduling nightmare." My stomach dropped. I hadn't expected them to bring it up. "Graduation?" Eleanor asked, her voice cutting through the laughter like a knife. "You missed her graduation." "Oh, not college," Tiffany corrected, giggling. "Her master's, the MBA thing. It was the same day as my engagement party for the last one." She waved her hand dismissively. "Ashley didn't mind. She's so independent. She knows I need the support more. I'm the emotional one." "We made the right call," my father agreed, slapping Mark on the back. "Ashley is tough. She ate a burger in her gown and got over it. But Tiffany needed her family. And look where we are now. A beautiful wedding." The table laughed. My parents laughed. Tiffany beamed. I didn't laugh. I took a sip of my water, staring straight ahead. Eleanor wasn't laughing either. She slowly set her glass down. She looked at my parents, who were grinning like Cheshire cats, and then she looked at me. For the first time, I saw something other than judgment in her eyes. I saw recognition. She saw the cruelty disguised as family dynamics. She saw the neglect dressed up as independence. She saw me. "Interesting," Eleanor said. The single word stopped the laughter at her end of the table. "It is fascinating to see where priorities lie." My parents, oblivious to the frost in her tone, took it as a compliment. "Exactly," my mother chirped. "Family first." I caught Eleanor's eye. She gave me the slightest nod, almost imperceptible. It was permission. It was an acknowledgement that whatever happened tomorrow, she understood why. The dinner wound down. We walked out into the cool night air. Tiffany hugged me, smelling of wine and entitlement. "Tomorrow is going to be perfect," she whispered. "Make sure I look like a queen." "Don't worry, Tiffany," I whispered back, pulling away. "You're going to get exactly the attention you deserve." I walked to my car, the blueprints on my tablet glowing in my bag. The rising action was over. The stage was set. Tomorrow the curtain would rise and the architect was finally going to bring the house down. The ceremony was a masterpiece of orchestrated emotion. The sun dipped below the horizon at the exact moment Tiffany said, "I do," bathing the outdoor chapel in a golden cinematic glow that I had timed down to the second. I stood in the shadows of the archway, holding my clipboard, like a shield, watching my sister weep perfectly photogenic tears. She looked stunning, I had to admit. The dress, a custom Vera Wang I had bullied a boutique in New York into rushing, fit her like a second skin. My parents sat in the front row, dabbing their eyes, the picture of proud, devoted guardians. To any outsider, it was a fairy tale. To me, it was the preamble to the main event. As the couple kissed and the string quartet swelled into a triumphant exit song, I tapped my earpiece. "Execute Phase 2, I whispered. "Open the ballroom." The reception venue was the crown jewel of the St. Regis. I had transformed the cavernous space into a winter wonderland of white silk crystal and pale gold. Thousands of orchids cascaded from the ceiling, and the lighting was programmed to shift subtly throughout the night, mimicking the northern lights. As the guests filed in for the cocktail hour, I heard the collective gasp. It was the reaction every planner lives for, the sound of pure, unadulterated awe. Waiters circulated with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres that cost more than my first car. I stood by the massive double doors, the gatekeeper of the evening, wearing a black tuxedo dress that was sharp, professional, and severe. Then came the moment of truth. The seating. Usually guests find their own seats via a chart, but for the VIPs, the families, I had insisted on a personal escort to ensure maximum impact. And I saw my parents and Tiffany approaching, flanked by Mark and his parents Eleanor and Robert. Tiffany was beaming high on adrenaline and attention. "Ashley," she squealed, rushing over. "Did you hear them? Everyone is saying it's the most beautiful wedding they've ever seen." "It is, isn't it?" I said, my voice smooth as glass. "I told you I would make you royalty." I turned to Eleanor Vance. She looked regal in midnight blue velvet. "Mrs. Vance, Mr. Vance," I said, gesturing with a practiced sweep of my arm. "If you would follow me, I have arranged for the groom's family to have the premier placement." I led them into the center of the room. I had placed 3 round tables on a slightly elevated platform in the dead center of the ballroom, the prime zone. They had the best view of the dance floor, the perfect lighting for photos, and a dedicated team of 5 servers. It was the seat of honor. "Exquisite," Eleanor murmured, nodding at the floral centerpiece that towered above them without blocking sightlines. "You have outdone yourself, Ashley." "Please sit," I said. "Enjoy the view." I turned back to my family. Tiffany, Mark, and my parents were waiting, expecting to be led to the same dais, or perhaps an even higher one. "And now," I said, a bright, helpful smile plastered on my face, "for the bride and her family, follow me." I didn't walk toward the center. I didn't walk toward the dance floor. I turned sharp right and began walking toward the perimeter of the room. Tiffany followed, her brow furrowing slightly, but she said nothing, assuming perhaps there was a special alcove. We walked past the guest tables. We walked past the band. We kept walking. The glamorous lighting began to fade, replaced by the harsher utilitarian light spilling from the service corridor. We reached the back corner of the ballroom. It was a tight, awkward space wedged between the heavy swinging doors of the kitchen and the entrance to the restrooms. The air here was noticeably different, colder, drafty, and smelling faintly of industrial dishwasher steam. There, pushed against the wall, was a small circular table. It was set beautifully. Of course, I wasn't a monster about the aesthetics, but the location was undeniable. It was the vendor table spot. The "we ran out of room" spot. "Here we are," I announced, pulling out a chair. The silence that descended on our little group was absolute. Tiffany stared at the table. She stared at the swinging kitchen door, which flew open. Just then, a waiter rushing out with a tray of dirty dishes, narrowly missing the skirt of her gown. The clatter of silverware and the shouting of chefs spilled out into the elegant ballroom for a split second before the door swung shut. "What is this?" Tiffany whispered, her voice trembling. "Your table," I said simply. "This is the back of the room." My father sputtered, his face turning a shade of red that clashed with his tie. "Ashley, this must be a mistake. Where is the dais? Where is the raised platform?" "There was a change in logistics," I explained, checking my watch. "The fire marshal had concerns about blocking the egress with a second platform. Safety first." "Safety!" Tiffany shrieked. The sound cut through the ambient jazz, causing several nearby guests to turn their heads. "I am the bride. I can't sit by the kitchen. I can't sit in the dark. Look at Mark's family. They're in the center of the room." "Yes," I said calmly. "They are guests. We treat guests with the utmost hospitality." "We are not guests," my mother hissed, stepping forward, her finger wagging in my face. "We are the hosts. We are your parents. Fix this, Ashley. Fix this right now. Move us to the center." "I can't," I said, clutching my clipboard against my chest. "The floor plan is set. The service relies on grid coordinates. If I move you, the entire dinner service collapses." "I don't care about the dinner service," Tiffany screamed, stamping her foot. "I want people to see me." "But Tiffany," I said, my voice dropping, becoming dangerously reasonable. "I thought this is what you wanted. I thought this was comfortable for you." "Comfortable?" she gaped at me. "I'm next to the bathroom." I took a step back, letting the veneer of the helpful sister slip just enough to reveal the steel beneath. I pitched my voice perfectly loud enough to carry over the music, loud enough for the tables nearby to hear, and crucially loud enough for Eleanor Vance, who I saw approaching from the center of the room to investigate the commotion, to hear every word. "Well," I said, looking from my parents to my sister, "you missed my graduation, the biggest day of my life, because you didn't want to be inconvenienced by a schedule. You told me you couldn't handle the spotlight of a ceremony, so I assumed for this big day you'd prefer to be out of the spotlight too. I'm just respecting your privacy." The words hung in the air like smoke. My father's mouth opened and closed. My mother looked as if I had slapped her. The reference to the graduation, the wound they thought was healed or at least forgotten, was suddenly bleeding fresh in front of everyone. You petty little... My father started stepping toward me aggressively. "Keep your voice down," I warned, my tone shifting to pure ice. "You are at a St. Regis event. Do not make a scene or I will have security escort you out. And wouldn't that be a headline?" "Mark," Tiffany wailed, turning to her new husband, "do something. She's ruining my wedding." Mark looked terrified. He looked at me, then at the table, then at his wife. Maybe we can squeeze in a chair somewhere else." "No," a voice cut in. It wasn't mine. Eleanor Vance stepped into the circle of light. She stood tall, her presence commanding immediate silence. She looked at the kitchen doors. She looked at the cramped table. Then she looked at my parents, who were shaking with rage. "Mrs. Vance!" My mother began, her voice pitching up into a desperate whine. "Ashley is having a breakdown. She's jealous. She's trying to humiliate us." Eleanor didn't look at my mother. She looked at me. "You seated them here because they missed your graduation. They prioritized a napkin crisis over my master's degree," I said clearly. "I merely thought they would appreciate a seating arrangement that reflected their values, family intimacy over public spectacle." Eleanor turned to Tiffany. The matriarch's face was unreadable, a mask of aristocratic calm. "Is this true?" Eleanor asked. "You made your parents skip her graduation for a party planning session." "It wasn't a big deal," Tiffany cried, wiping a smudge of mascara from her cheek. "Ashley is always fine, I needed them. And look what she's doing now. She's jealous because I'm the one getting married to a wealthy man and she's just the help." The air left the room. Even Mark winced. Eleanor stared at Tiffany for a long, agonizing moment. She looked at the entitled set of her jaw, the way she clung to Mark like a possession, the sheer lack of grace in her moment of stress. Then Eleanor looked at me, standing straight, working composed, dignified in the face of their tantrums. "A brilliant choice, Ashley," Eleanor said. My parents froze. Tiffany blinked. "What?" "The seating," Eleanor clarified, smoothing her velvet gloves. "It puts the focus on the guests, which is proper etiquette. A host should never elevate themselves above those they have invited. It shows a lack of breeding." "But, Eleanor," my mother stammered. Eleanor raised a hand. "Stop. Just stop. You are making a spectacle of yourselves." She turned her cold gaze onto Tiffany. "Stop screeching. You look common." Tiffany gasped, recoiling as if struck. "I'm your daughter-in-law." "Yes," Eleanor said, and the word sounded like a sentence. "You are. And I have been observing you and your family for months. I watched how you treated your sister. I watched how you treated the staff. I watched you throw a tantrum over soup." Eleanor stepped closer to the huddled group, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper that I could hear perfectly. "I was going to pay for the honeymoon in the Maldives," Eleanor said. "I was going to put the down payment on the brownstone in the city. I thought perhaps you were just high-spirited. But seeing how you treat your own blood, seeing how you treat the sister who built this entire evening for you for free." She shook her head, a look of profound disappointment on her face. "I think that money is better spent elsewhere. Charity, perhaps? Or maybe I'll invest it in a business run by someone who actually understands the value of work." Her eyes flicked briefly to me. "You can't do that," Tiffany screamed, grabbing Mark's arm. "Mark, tell her that's our money." Mark, finally finding a spine, gently peeled Tiffany's fingers off his arm. He didn't speak, but he stepped back, aligning himself physically closer to his mother than his new wife. Enjoy your dinner, Eleanor said, turning her back on them. The acoustics are terrible back here, but I suppose you'll have plenty to discuss. She walked back toward the center of the room, her head high. I stood there for 1 second longer looking at my family. They were stunned, seated in the shadows, the smell of dish soap wafting over them. I'll send a server with the wine, I said professionally. I recommend the house white. It's what we serve the vendors. I turned on my heel and walked away, leaving them in the dark just as the band struck up a lively, joyous tune for the rest of the room. The climax had hit, the structure had held, and the seating chart was etched in stone. Walking away from that table was the longest 10 yards of my life, but I didn't stumble. I could feel their eyes boring into my back. My father's confused rage, my mother's indignation, and Tiffany's sheer paralyzed shock. But as I crossed the threshold from the service corridor back into the main ballroom, the atmosphere shifted instantly. I stepped out of the drafty shadows and into the warm, golden light of the world I had built. The music washed over me, a sophisticated jazz standard that covered the sounds of the kitchen behind me. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of expensive lilies and beeswax candles. I adjusted my earpiece, smoothed the lapel of my tuxedo dress, and went back to work. The rest of the reception was a masterclass in compartmentalization. I was running a high-stakes event, and I refused to let the implosion of my biological family derail my professional reputation. In fact, the adrenaline from the confrontation seemed to sharpen my senses. I was everywhere at once, subtly signaling the sommelier to refill glasses, guiding the photographer to the best angles, and ensuring the lighting transitioned from dinner warmth to dance floor cool at the precise moment the dessert course was cleared. From my vantage point near the bar, I occasionally glanced back at the corner table. It was a pathetic tableau. My parents and Tiffany sat there trapped in the containment zone I had designed. They couldn't leave without making a scene, and they couldn't move because every other seat was assigned and occupied. They were forced to endure the dinner course by course while servers squeezed past them with dirty plates. I saw Tiffany trying to wave down a waiter for more wine, but he was busy serving the head table, the real head table where Eleanor Vance was holding court, laughing with her cousins, and pointedly ignoring the existence of the bride. As the night wore on, the dynamic in the room began to shift in a way I hadn't explicitly planned, but had secretly hoped for. The guests, Eleanor's guests, began to notice me. These were people who understood the language of luxury. They knew that flowers didn't arrange themselves and that seamless timelines didn't happen by accident. I was checking the inventory list on my tablet when a woman in a stunning emerald silk gown approached me. I recognized her immediately, Margaret Sterling, the wife of a real estate tycoon and a board member of the city's largest charitable foundation. "Excuse me," she said, her voice raspy and elegant. "Are you the one running this ship?" I looked up, flashing my professional smile. "I am. Ashley Smith. Is everything to your liking, Mrs. Sterling?" She looked around the room, taking in the floating candles and the custom velvet draping. "It's not just to my liking, dear. It's flawless. I've been to 3 weddings at the St. Regis this year, and they were all chaotic bores compared to this. The flow is intuitive. The aesthetic is restrained yet opulent. Who is your firm?" "I'm actually independent," I said, handing her a card I had printed just 2 days prior. "Smith Event Design. This is my sister's wedding, so it's a personal project, but I am accepting select clients for the upcoming season." She took the card, studying the heavy cardstock and the embossed font. "Independent. Well, you won't be for long. I have a gala in November for the Arts Council. I'm firing my current planner on Monday. Expect a call." It didn't stop there. As I moved through the room checking on the band, I was stopped 3 more times. A venture capitalist wanted to know if I did corporate retreats. A socialite asked if I could handle a debutante ball in Paris. By the time the cake was cut, I had 5 solid leads and 3 business cards tucked into my blazer pocket. I wasn't just the sister anymore. I was a commodity. I was the architect, and the market was validating me in real time. The cake cutting was the final act of the play. I had to go retrieve Tiffany. When I approached the bad table, the mood was funereal. My father was sulking, staring into a glass of warm water. My mother looked like she had aged 10 years. Tiffany's eyes were red-rimmed, her makeup smudged. "It's time for the cake," I said, my voice flat. "I hate you," Tiffany hissed, standing up. Her dress was wrinkled from sitting in the cramped chair. "You ruined everything." "The photographer is waiting," I replied, ignoring her. "Fix your face. You're on stage." She pulled herself together with the terrifying muscle memory of a narcissist. She pasted on a smile, grabbed Mark's hand, and marched to the center of the room. They cut the cake. The guests cheered. But the energy was hollow. Mark looked nauseous, and Tiffany's smile didn't reach her eyes. Eleanor watched from her table, sipping champagne, her expression unreadable. When the night ended, I didn't stay for the cleanup. I handed the checklist to the banquet captain, grabbed my bag, and walked out the front door. I didn't say goodbye to my parents. I didn't say goodbye to Tiffany. I got into a taxi, kicked off my heels, and watched the city lights blur past my window. I felt lighter than I had in years. The real fallout didn't hit until a week later. I was sitting in a temporary office space I had rented with the deposit from Mrs. Sterling's gala contract. The sun was streaming in, illuminating a fresh stack of vendor contracts. My phone rang. It was my father. I stared at the screen for a long moment. I almost didn't answer. But the curiosity, the need to know the extent of the damage, won out. I swiped right. "Ashley!" His voice was a roar. "Are you happy now? Are you satisfied?" "Hello, Dad," I said calmly, putting him on speaker and continuing to organize my files. "I assume you're calling about the wedding photos. The proofs should be ready in—" "I'm not calling about the damn photos," he shouted. "I'm calling about the letter we just received from the Vance family attorney." I stopped typing. "Oh." Eleanor cut her off. He choked out the reality of the money loss, clearly causing him physical pain. She amended the trust. Mark keeps his access, but there's a new clause. Spousal exclusion. Tiffany doesn't get a dime of the family assets. No joint accounts funded by the trust. No access to the vacation properties. And the house down payment gone. Eleanor donated it to a scholarship fund for underprivileged business students. "Is that your doing? Did you tell her to do that?" I couldn't help it. A small, genuine laugh escaped my lips. Eleanor Vance was a poet. "I didn't tell her to do anything, Dad. Eleanor is a smart woman. She observed the situation and made a financial decision. That's what happens in the real world. Actions have consequences." "Tiffany is hysterical," my mother screamed from the background. "She has to go back to work. She was going to quit the boutique. How is she supposed to live?" "She has a degree in fashion marketing, doesn't she?" I asked. "And Mark is an accountant. I'm sure they can budget for a nice apartment. Millions of people do it every day." "You cost this family millions," my father bellowed. "You selfish, vindictive—" "I cost you nothing," I interrupted, my voice sharpening. "I saved you $15,000 in planning fees. I gave you the wedding you asked for. I gave you the spotlight, and now I'm giving you something else." "What?" he demanded. "Space," I said. "You missed my graduation because you didn't value my time. You expected me to work for free because you didn't value my skill. Now I'm valuing myself. I'm done, Dad. I'm not the backup plan anymore. I'm not the retirement fund. I'm not the help." "You can't do this," he sputtered. "We're your parents." "Then act like it," I said. "Goodbye." I hung up. The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't lonely. It was peaceful. I tapped the block caller button on my father's contact. Then I did the same for my mother. And finally for Tiffany. I sat there for a moment, listening to the hum of the city outside my window. My phone buzzed again. I braced myself, expecting Mark or a cousin. But it was a notification from my email. Subject: Contract Inquiry. Autumn Gala. Sender: Eleanor Vance. Message: Ashley. I have a foundation dinner in December. I require someone who understands that details matter. Full rate, of course. Let's have lunch. I smiled, picking up my pen. I had lost a family that never really saw me, but I had gained a future that was entirely my own. The rising action was over. The climax had shattered the old order. Now, in the falling action of my life, I was finally the one writing the script. I opened a new document and began to type. The first snow of December fell on the city exactly 1 year later, dusting the awnings of the high-end boutiques I now partnered with. My office, a corner suite with a view of the skyline, was quiet. My staff had gone home for the holidays, leaving me alone with the hum of the heater and a year's worth of triumphs filed away in the cabinets. Smith Event Design was no longer a startup. It was the gold standard. I had planned Mrs. Sterling's gala, 3 society weddings, and a corporate retreat for a Fortune 500 company. I was exhausted, wealthy, and professionally fulfilled. But as I watched the snow swirl against the glass, I felt the familiar hollow ache that success couldn't quite fill. I hadn't spoken to my parents or Tiffany in 12 months. I had heard rumors, of course, social circles are small. I knew Tiffany and Mark were living in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Queens. I knew Tiffany was working. I knew my parents were aging, their social calendar shrinking as their golden child could no longer fund their vicarious lifestyle. Then the letter arrived. It wasn't a text or an email. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope handwritten in my mother's looping script. I had let it sit on my desk for 3 days before opening it. When I finally did, I didn't find the guilt trip I expected. I found a surrender. Ashley, it read, we are not asking for money. We are not asking for a favor. We are just asking for a cup of coffee. We miss our daughter. Not the planner, the daughter. Please. It was the please that broke me. It was shaky, the ink slightly smudged. I agreed to meet them at a neutral location, a bustling coffee shop downtown, far from the St. Regis, far from the scenes of our past crimes. I arrived 10 minutes early, a habit I couldn't break, and secured a booth. When they walked in, I almost didn't recognize them. My father's posture, usually so puffed with self-importance, was stooped. My mother looked tired, her hair simpler, her jewelry absent. And Tiffany. Tiffany was the biggest shock of all. She wasn't wearing designer silk. She was wearing a sensible wool coat and flat boots. She looked tired, but she also looked grounded. They slid into the booth opposite me. The silence was thick, smelling of roasted beans and damp wool. You look good, Ashley, my father said, his voice rough. We saw your picture in the paper, the Sterling Gala. It looked incredible. Thank you, I said, keeping my hands wrapped around my mug. It was a lot of work. We know, Tiffany said. Her voice was quiet, lacking its usual shrill edge. She looked down at her hands. Her nails were short, unpolished. I work at Bergdorf's now, in personal shopping, junior associate. I raised an eyebrow. That's a tough gig, on your feet all day. Eleanor arranged the interview, Tiffany admitted, a wry smile touching her lips. She told me that if I wanted to see a dime of inheritance one day, I had to learn what it felt like to earn a paycheck first. She said it builds character. She looked up at me, and for the first time in 28 years, I saw my sister, not a caricature. My feet hurt all the time. Customers are mean. They yell about things that don't matter. And every time they do, I think about how I treated you. My mother reached across the table, her hand hovering near mine, but not touching it, respecting the boundary I had drawn. We were wrong, Ashley. We got so caught up in the image of our family, the weddings, the appearances. We stopped seeing the reality. We took your strength for granted because it was easier than dealing with Tiffany's needs. I was a brat, Tiffany corrected. I was a spoiled, entitled brat, and you were right to put me in the back. I needed to sit in the dark to realize I wasn't the son. I looked at them. I looked for the angle, the manipulation, the request for a loan. But I saw only 3 people who had been humbled by a year of silence and hard reality. They looked smaller, but more real. The anger that had fueled me for a year finally began to evaporate, leaving behind a quiet peace. "I'm not planning any more free weddings," I said, my voice soft but firm. "We know," my father said quickly. "We don't want a planner. We just want to know how you are. We want to know our daughter." The conversation that followed was hesitant, awkward, but genuine. We talked about the weather, about Mark's accounting job, about my new apartment. It wasn't a movie ending. There were no tears of ecstatic joy, no hugs that erased the past. But there was respect. For the first time, they were listening to me, not waiting for me to fix something. When the check came, my father reached for his wallet, his old reflex kicking in. I saw the fraying leather, the hesitation in his hand. "I got it," I said, placing my corporate card on the tray. "Ashley, no, you don't have to," he started. "I know I don't have to," I said, looking him in the eye. "I want to. It's on me." It was a power move, yes, but it was also an act of kindness. It was the final signal that the dynamic had shifted permanently. I was no longer the child seeking approval. I was the matriarch of my own life, extending grace. We walked out into the snow. The city lights were blinking on red and green for Christmas. "Same time next week?" Tiffany asked, sounding hopeful. "Let's check our calendars," I said, buttoning my coat. "But, yes, I think I can make time." I watched them walk toward the subway station, no more town cars for them, and then I turned toward my office. The wind was cold, but I felt warm. I had taken my revenge, I had built my empire, and in the end I had done something even harder. I had forced my family to grow up, and in doing so I had found a way to let them back in. The seating chart was finally balanced. Everyone was exactly where they were supposed to be, and that brings us to the end of Ashley's journey, proving that sometimes the sharpest revenge is simply knowing your own worth. What do you think? Did the family deserve a second chance, or should Ashley have walked away forever? Please hit subscribe if you enjoyed this episode. We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Radiance. We'll see you next time.